This is our final message in the series about heaven called Thinking About Home. And for our final topic, I've chosen the subject, No Night There. In the last chapter of the last book of the Bible, we read these words about heaven. And there shall be no night there. Many of us have learned to appreciate the night. It may represent solitude, quiet, peaceful hours, rest, meditation and prayer. As the psalmist said, "In the night his song shall be with me, in my prayer unto the God of my life, when I remember thee upon my bed and meditate on thee in the night watches." But this is a learned response. It's not a natural response. For some of us, it involved learning faith. Again, the psalmist said, "The day is thine, the night also is thine. And thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night." And the Bible says that God shows forth his loving kindness in the morning and his faithfulness every night. The Bible even says that God giveth songs in the night. But these are things that we learn as Christians, and we claim them as we grow in faith. The natural response to the darkness and shadows of night is doubt and fear. I remember my fears as a small child. I was afraid to walk outside at night, even holding my parents' hand. When I went to bed, I was afraid of every shadow in the room with me. I was afraid to look out the window for fear of what might be out there looking back at me. I hated the night. I got over it as I learned to trust God and as I learned to recognize the unreasonableness of my many fears. Most of us have learned to accept the night, and we realize that it contains some God-given benefits for us. But even so, there are times in all of our lives when we still dread and despise the night. As Job said, "When I lie down, I say, when shall I rise, and the night be gone? And I am full of tossings to and fro unto the dawning of the day. My bones are pierced in me in the night season, and my sinews take no rest." And the psalmist said, "I am weary with my groaning. All the night make I my bed to swim. I water my couch with my tears." There are times when the words of our text this morning don't mean much to us. They're just an interesting fact that when we get to heaven, there will be no night there. But when you go through nights of suffering and fear and sorrow, and you long for the night to end, then these words become some of the most meaningful descriptions of heaven that you will ever read. The darkness of night is an emblem of gloom, of wandering and stumbling, of fear and uncertainty, and even of death. And it's when we're in the midst of this darkness that God imposes upon us the discipline of walking by faith. When we cry in the solitude and darkness for help, God reaches down his hand to lift us up and reminds us through the inspired words of the apostle that there shall be no night there. When we grope in the darkness, too blind to see the way, God gives us his word for a lamp unto our feet and to light our path. And he reminds us that the gloom through which we must pass is to keep alive in our hearts a longing for that home that's awaiting us, and that there shall be no night there. Our life in this world is just a passing through the night to the morning. The psalmist said, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." In this world, we may have the darkness of the night of temptation and sin and guilt. Solomon gave us a description that typifies temptation and pictures a person's approach into sin. In Proverbs chapter 7, he said, "For at the window of my house I looked through my casement, and beheld among the simple ones, I discerned among the youths a young man void of understanding, passing through the street near her corner. And he went the way to her house, in the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark night." Jesus said that light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. The devil often brings people down by tempting them at night under cover of darkness. And sin always leads to greater darkness. The guilt of sin is a dark night. Isaiah said, "My heart panted, fearfulness affrighted me. The night of my pleasure hath he turned into fear unto me." When you realize that you have grieved and offended a righteous God, it's a dark night. When you realize your own weakness, the dread of temptation, the consciousness of failure, the sense of helplessness, and the fear of exposure, the night grows darker and darker. And then there's the night of depression. All of us experience depression at some times in our lives. But for some it seems to be worse, almost unbearable. With some Christians it's winter, long nights with short days, much darkness and cold. With others it's summer, only short nights and long days with the bloom of flowers and the song of birds and beauty all around them. One man who suffered from depression gives us an account of his ordeal. He said, "Orphan Annie sang with optimism, 'The sun'll come out tomorrow.' But for me, it didn't. 6 months I waited, 9, a year, but no sun. A year and a half and still no sun. During that long, dark night, I went to my office and tried to work, but it all seemed so pointless. I tried reading but couldn't concentrate. I prayed, but ended up on the floor crying myself to sleep." One day he said, "I called out desperately to hear God. Had I been calling out too long or too loudly to hear his answer? Had I been attentive enough? It was a day that lent itself to being attentive when I finally did hear something. It was early spring. There were still 6 inches of snow on the ground. I walked in the backyard, stood, looked, listened. A gesture of wind touched my face. The sound of a dog barking. I looked around slowly. I saw plants pushing their way through the snow, struggling to be green. 2 seasons were competing for the same ground. Spring was struggling to be born. Winter was struggling not to die. Then I realized the truth. Something inside me was struggling to be born. Something else was struggling not to die. And they were both inside me at the same time, contesting each other. I sat there trying to be attentive, wondering what clue God might be offering to help me solve the mystery of what my life had become. And suddenly, effortlessly, a clue seemed to come. If new growth were to come to the backyard, the stubble must be mowed, the pine needles raked, the skunk cabbage dug up. The ground needed to be cleared before the new growth could appear. The plunging sharp edge of the shovel, the dragging metal teeth of the rake, the whirling blade of the lawnmower. If new life were indeed sprouting within me, it must have space to grow. Depression is a burying of the soul in the ground, where it waits in the cold, lonely darkness, waiting for the coming spring and the warmth of the sun. Except a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die, it cannot bear fruit. Depression, I learned, is not only the dark soil into which the grain falls, but also the soil out of which grows the fruit. Eventually the sun finally came out. Annie was right. She just had lousy timing. Someone once said, learning to weep, learning to keep vigil, learning to wait for the dawn. We need to learn how to weep without drowning in self-pity. We need to learn how to keep vigil, even when the darkness seems unending. And we need to learn how to wait for the dawn with faith in God. And then there's the night of searching, of confusion, of seeking God's will and direction. Isaiah said, "We grope for the wall like the blind, and we grope as if we had no eyes. We stumble at noonday as in the night. We are in desolate places as dead men." I've learned to view with some degree of skepticism these people who seem to always know with absolute certainty that every move they make is God's perfect will. and especially those who seem to have their entire life mapped out in advance with the same certainty that it is God's perfect will for them. I don't think God works that way. The Bible says, "A man's heart deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps." And the prophet Jeremiah said, "O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps." The fact is, sometimes we have no idea where we're going. We can't see the road ahead of us, and we can't know for certain where it will end. In fact, we often don't even know ourselves. The fact that I think I'm following God's will doesn't mean that I actually am. We can only trust God and seek His direction and His will for our lives. Psalm 37:23 says, "The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and He delighteth in His way." And in Psalm 119:133, the psalmist said, "Order my steps in thy word, and let not any iniquity have dominion over me." I believe that the honest desire to please God does please God. And if we have that desire in everything we do, that God will direct our steps according to His will, even though we may not know anything about it. Our job is to trust, even when we aren't sure where we are or where we're going. Sometimes Christians use terminology that's confusing. We talk about discovering God's will. I believe if you seek God's will, you will find it. But you'll find it like the little girl who lived at the edge of a forest. She loved to play and explore the woods. But one day she went too deep into the forest and got lost. As the shadows grew long, the girl began to get worried. So did her parents. They searched the forest for her, cupping their hands and calling out her name, but there was no answer. As the night grew darker, the little girl tried one path after another, but none of them led in the right direction. Her skin was welted from the switching of limbs as she pushed her way through the thick growth. Her knees were scraped from tripping in the dark. Her face was streaked from the tears she had cried. She called for her parents, but the forest seemed to swallow her words. Finally, the exhausted girl curled up on the forest floor and fell asleep. But the girl's father didn't sleep. He continued searching all night. In the first light of dawn, he spotted his daughter asleep in the middle of a clearing. As fast as his legs would take him, calling her name, he ran to her. The noise startled the little girl awake. She rubbed her eyes, and reaching out to him, she said, "Daddy, I found you." That's what happens to us. We search for the right path. We stumble in darkness. And when God comes and takes us by the hand and leads us in the direction we should go, we say, "I discovered God's will." And there's the night of affliction and suffering. There are some lessons for us to learn from bodily ailments, from physical pain, from infirmity, from inability to work. The classic scriptural example of suffering is Job. Job said, "And now my soul is poured out upon me. The days of my affliction have taken hold upon me. I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and thou regardest me not." Job said, in effect, "God, where are you? Speak to me, teach me, rebuke me, strike me down, but don't remain silent." And he said again, "Even today is my complaint bitter. My stroke is heavier than my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would order my cause before him and fill my mouth with arguments." That sounds strange to us, almost kind of disrespectful to God. But one bold message in the book of Job is that you can say anything to God. You can throw at him your grief, your anger, your doubts, your disappointments. He can absorb them all. Often the great men of the Bible are shown contending with God. They would rather go away limping like Jacob than to shut God out. Things that you can't say to anyone else, you can say to God. Since you can't make your feelings go away, take them to God and express them honestly. God can deal with every human response, except one. The one we may want to fall back on instinctively. God cannot abide an attempt
to ignore him or to treat him as though he doesn't exist. But that response never occurred to Job. There's another story in the Bible about suffering. In Luke chapter 8, it says, "And a woman having an issue of blood 12 years, which had spent all her living upon physicians, neither could be healed of any, came behind Jesus, and touched the border of his garment, and immediately her issue of blood stanched. And Jesus said, 'Who touched me?' When all denied, Peter and they that were with him said, 'Master, the multitude throng thee and press thee, and sayest thou, Who touched me?' And Jesus said, 'Somebody hath touched me, for I perceive that virtue is gone out of me.' And when the woman saw that she was not hid, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared unto him before all the people for what cause she had touched him, and how she was immediately healed. And he said unto her, 'Daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace.'" There are some lessons for us to learn in this passage about affliction and suffering. The first one is that the human touch has the power to arrest God, to stop him, to halt him, to turn his attention towards your problems, your pain, your prayer. You may think, well, God already knows all about it. What's the point? He must not be interested. But here's the record in black and white, in the words of Scripture. Jesus was stopped by the touch of a sick woman. He turned around. The King of Kings, the one who conquered death, the one who defeated Satan, the one who couldn't be stopped by all the legions of hell, he stopped just because a sick and nameless woman touched the hem of his garment. Another lesson to learn is that the healthy seldom reach out to the great physician. The people may have come in crowds to hear Jesus, but it was those who suffered greatly who reached out to grasp him. The best picture that the French painter Tissot ever painted shows Jesus walking along a road. A long string of people are sitting by the roadside, one in a crutch, one on a cot, each one with a different infirmity, all waiting for Jesus. Behind him, there's no one sitting on the roadside. They've all been restored to health. They're running and leaping across the fields going home. They've all been healed. But suppose they had never been afflicted. Our suffering causes us to reach out to God and brings us closer to him. It's for our eternal good. It brings about growth that would never have been possible in any other way. The next thing we can learn from suffering is that there's mercy with the Lord. Let me read several verses from the Psalms. "But I will sing of thy power. Yea, I will sing aloud of thy mercy in the morning. For thou hast been my defense and refuge in the day of trouble. Blessed be God, which hath not turned away my prayer, nor his mercy from me. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. For as the heaven is high above the earth, so great is his mercy toward them that fear him." These are just a few verses from the Psalms. There's so many more. Jesus saw this woman suffering through merciful eyes, eyes that understood, eyes that saw the whole story of her life. If you need to be reminded of God's mercy, just read the 136th Psalm. Faith is forged on the anvil of suffering. The hemorrhaging woman's faith was forged on the anvil of 12 long years of suffering, years of disillusionment, years of shattered dreams. When she was finally able to lay her troubles at the feet of Jesus, then she could go in peace. And finally, there's the night of bereavement. Some of us have experienced this. All of us most likely will experience this. Of all the dark nights, this is the one that I shun the most. In many cases, it's easier to die than to see someone else die. For many of us, this will be the darkest of all nights. And all we can do is trust God, seek His presence, allow Him to comfort us, and believe that weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. One day the morning will come and drive away the night forever. I want to close this message and this series with this story from the book, God Works the Night Shift. He was a strong man, facing an enemy beyond his strength. His young wife had become gravely ill, then suddenly passed away, leaving the big man alone with a wide-eyed, flaxen-haired girl not quite 5 years old. The service in the village chapel was simple and heavy with grief. After the burial at the small cemetery, the man's neighbors gathered around him. "Please bring your little girl and stay with us for several days," someone said. "You shouldn't go back home just yet." Broken-hearted though he was, the man answered, "Thank you, friends, for the kind offer, but we need to go back home where she was. My baby and I must face this." So they returned, the big man and his little girl, to what now seemed an empty, lifeless house. The man brought his daughter's little bed into his room so they could face this first dark night together. As the minutes slipped by that night, the young girl was having a dreadful time trying to sleep, and so was her father. What could pierce a man's heart deeper than a child sobbing for a mother who would never come back? Long into the night, the little one continued to weep. The big man reached down into her bed and tried to comfort her as best he could. After a while, the little girl managed to stop crying, but only out of sorrow for her father. Thinking his daughter was asleep, the father looked up and said brokenly, "I trust you, Father, but it's as dark as midnight." Hearing her dad's prayer, the little girl began to cry again. "I thought you were asleep, baby," he said. "Papa, I did try. I was sorry for you. I did try, but I couldn't go to sleep." "Papa, did you ever know it could be so dark?" "Why, Papa? I can't even see you, it's so dark." Then through her tears, the little girl whispered, "But you love me even if it's dark, don't you, Papa? You love me even if I don't see you, don't you, Papa?" For an answer, the big man reached across with his massive hands, lifted his little girl out of her bed, brought her over to his chest, and held her until at last she fell asleep. When she was finally quiet, he began to pray. He took his little daughter's cry to him and passed it up to God. "Father, it's dark as midnight. I can't see you at all, but you love me. Even when it's dark and I can't see, you love me, don't you?" As difficult as it can be for us, there's a reason why there is night here. God has a purpose in our nights of temptation, of depression, of searching and confusion, of affliction and suffering, and bereavement. There are many lessons we need to learn, sometimes hard, difficult lessons. In the words of Kim Moore's song, "Let me trust you in the valley dark, as well as in the light, knowing you will always lead me. Your will is always right. I know God makes no mistakes. He leads in every path I take. along the way that's leading me to home. Though at times my heart would break, there's a purpose in every change he makes, that others would see my life and know that God makes no mistakes. One day the night will be past. Joy will come in the morning, and for the rest of eternity, there shall be no night there.
Will